My hands were still shaking from my morning coffee when the phone shattered the 8:47 a.m. silence like glass breaking in a cathedral. The caller's voice carried that particular urgency that cuts through routine and demands immediate attention. Not panic, but the controlled alarm of someone witnessing something that doesn't belong in the ordinary world. "Dr. Leclerc, we need you at Brookfield Elementary right away. There's a dog that's collapsed near the front entrance, and the children—" She paused, searching for words that could capture something beyond normal experience. "The children are acting strange. They've formed a circle around him, but they won't go near. They're just standing there, watching. It's like they understand something we don't. I'm Dr. Anna Leclerc, and I've been practicing veterinary medicine in this small Connecticut town for 9 years, long enough to recognize when a call carries weight beyond the immediate emergency." Something in Principal Martinez's voice suggested this wasn't a simple case of an injured stray needing medical attention. This was something else. Something that had disrupted the normal rhythm of a school morning in ways that made adults uncomfortable and children instinctively reverent. The morning had started like any other, checking overnight patients, reviewing the day's surgery schedule, responding to emails from concerned pet parents. But there had been an underlying tension in the air, a quality of anticipation that I'd attributed to the approaching storm front the Weather Service had been tracking all week. Now, driving toward Brookfield Elementary with my emergency kit rattling in the passenger seat, I wondered if the atmosphere had been preparing me for something I couldn't have anticipated. Before I tell you what I found at that school, I need to know something. Can you tell me in the comments where you're watching from? Your country? Your city? Sometimes when I'm driving toward cases that feel heavier than medicine usually requires, I wonder if there are others out there who understand that some emergencies are about more than just treating injury or illness. The drive to Brookfield Elementary takes 7 minutes from my clinic, but that morning it felt like traveling through increasingly thick air. Every traffic light seemed to last an eternity. Every turn felt deliberate and consequential. The familiar streets of my hometown looked different somehow, charged with significance I couldn't name. By the time I pulled into the school's circular driveway, my chest was tight with anticipation for reasons I couldn't articulate. The scene at the school entrance defied everything I knew about how children typically respond to animals in distress. Instead of the chaotic cluster of curious kids I expected, 30 or 40 students had arranged themselves in a perfect circle around a collapsed dog. They stood in absolute silence, hands at their sides, faces serious with a gravity that seemed too mature for their ages. No pushing, no excited chatter, no attempts to pet or comfort the animal, just this profound, respectful stillness that felt almost ceremonial. Teachers hovered at the periphery, clearly unsettled by their students' behavior, but unwilling to break whatever spell had settled over the gathering. Mrs. Chen, the second-grade teacher, approached me as I gathered my supplies from the truck. "Dr. Leclerc, I've been teaching for 22 years, and I've never seen children respond to anything like this. They just knew. The moment they saw him collapse, they formed that circle without any instruction from us. And they've been standing there for almost 30 minutes, not moving, barely speaking. It's like they're protecting him." As I approached with my emergency kit, the children parted wordlessly to create a path, still maintaining their circular formation, but allowing me access to the animal at their center. Their eyes followed my movement with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for magic shows or storytelling, but there was nothing playful in their expressions. They watched with the solemnity of witnesses to something sacred. The dog was a medium-sized mixed breed, maybe 45 pounds, with a coat that had once been golden but was now matted with dried mud and decomposing leaves. He lay on his side, breathing shallowly, body trembling with the kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying something too heavy for too long. His ribs showed through his dull fur, evidence of prolonged hunger. But what stopped me cold wasn't his obvious physical distress. It was what he held clenched between his teeth, a child's mitten, pale blue wool, small enough to fit a 7 or 8-year-old hand, stained with something dark and dry that might have been mud or might have been something else entirely. The fabric was worn soft with age, the kind of beloved winter accessory that gets misplaced and mourned and eventually replaced. But this dog's jaw was locked around it with desperate determination, as if this small piece of fabric represented the most precious cargo in the world. When I knelt beside him and gently touched his muzzle, his amber eyes opened and focused on mine with startling clarity. There was intelligence there, purpose, and something that looked almost like relief. Without struggling or resistance, he opened his mouth and released the mitten directly into my palm. The gesture was so deliberate, so purposeful, that it felt like a transaction, as if he'd been waiting specifically for me to receive whatever message the mitten represented. The fabric was surprisingly heavy in my hand, weighted with more than just moisture and dirt. As I examined it more closely, I noticed details that made my chest tighten with recognition. Hand-knitted, with a distinctive cable pattern along the cuff, and initials embroidered in fading yellow thread. LB. "Has anyone reported a missing child recently?" I asked Mrs. Chen, though something in my gut already knew the answer would be more complicated than a simple yes or no. Her face went pale. "Not recently, but..." She glanced at the circle of children, lowering her voice. "2 years ago, we lost a student. Lila Brennan. She was walking home from school and just disappeared. They never found her." The mitten felt suddenly heavier in my hands. I loaded the dog carefully into my truck, conscious of the children's continued silent observation. As I secured him on the padded surface in my mobile treatment area, he remained perfectly still, conserving what little energy he had left. But his eyes never left my face, and in their amber depths I saw something that looked like trust mixed with urgent communication I couldn't yet decode. As I drove away from the school, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw the children still standing in their circle, now facing the direction of my departing vehicle, as if maintaining vigil until their mysterious guardian was safely beyond their protection. The image stayed with me during the entire drive back to my clinic, haunting in its suggestion that these young people understood something about what had just happened that the adults around them couldn't grasp. At the clinic, I ran through standard emergency protocols with mechanical precision while my mind struggled to process what I'd witnessed. The dog's vital signs were weak but stable. Dehydration, mild hypothermia, evidence of prolonged malnutrition. His temperature was several degrees below normal, his pulse thready but regular, his breathing shallow but consistent. Blood work revealed no infections, no systemic illness, nothing that would explain the dramatic collapse at the school. Physically, he was a young, fundamentally healthy animal who should have been running through fields, not collapsing in front of children who seemed to understand his significance better than any adult. But it was clear that whatever had brought him to that moment of crisis went deeper than simple medical intervention could address. The initial examination revealed several concerning details. His paws were worn raw from extensive travel over rough terrain, suggesting he'd covered significant distance to reach the school. His coat contained debris that hadn't originated in our immediate area, seeds from plants that grew in wetland environments, soil with a different mineral composition than our local ground, traces of industrial runoff that pointed to travel through areas near abandoned manufacturing sites. But most puzzling was his body condition. Despite obvious signs of prolonged hunger, his muscle tone remained surprisingly good. His teeth showed minimal wear for an animal his age, and his reflexes were sharp and responsive. It was as if his body had been sustained by something other than regular nutrition, kept functional by a purpose that transcended ordinary biological needs. And if stories like this move your heart the way they move mine, make sure you subscribe, so you don't miss what happened when I discovered what he'd been carrying inside his body and how it connected to a mystery that had haunted our community for years. The X-ray changed everything I thought I knew about what was possible. Lodged against the wall of his stomach, clearly visible on the imaging screen, was an object that had no business being inside a living creature. Not a toy or bone fragment or any of the usual items dogs accidentally ingest, but something metallic and precisely formed, spherical, about the size of a large marble, with delicate protrusions extending from its surface like the closed petals of some impossible flower. The object appeared to be made from a material that showed up as completely opaque on the X-ray, suggesting extreme density. But what made my hands shake as I studied the image was its position. Rather than sitting freely in the stomach cavity as a foreign object should, it appeared to be partially embedded in the stomach lining itself, as if it had grown there or been deliberately implanted with surgical precision. More disturbing still were the thread-like shadows extending from the central sphere, filaments so fine they were barely visible on the imaging, but clearly present, spreading throughout his abdominal cavity like the roots of some alien plant. Whatever this thing was, it had integrated itself into his anatomy with a sophistication that challenged everything I understood about biology and foreign body response. I scheduled emergency surgery for that afternoon, though I'll admit my hands were trembling as I prepped the surgical suite. In 15 years of veterinary practice, I'd removed everything from socks to jewelry to children's toys from animals' digestive systems, but I'd never encountered anything that looked deliberately engineered, purposefully placed, systematically integrated with living tissue. My surgical assistant, Jamie, helped me position the anesthetized dog on the table. His breathing remained steady under sedation, but his heart rate showed unusual patterns. Not irregular exactly, but synchronized with something other than his natural cardiac rhythm. It was as if the object inside him was maintaining its own temporal relationship with his biological functions. The surgery to remove the object took less than an hour, but those 60 minutes felt suspended outside normal time. As I made the incision and carefully exposed the stomach lining, I could see that the sphere had indeed embedded itself partially within the organ wall. The metallic surface was smooth, seamless, warm to the touch despite having been inside a body temperature environment for unknown periods. But it was what happened when I extracted it that convinced me I was dealing with something beyond conventional understanding. The moment my surgical forceps closed around the object, it pulsed once in my grasp. A single, deliberate throb that I felt through the instruments and into my bones. The pulse was accompanied by a sound just below the threshold of hearing. A subsonic vibration that seemed to resonate through the surgical table, the floor, the very walls of the room. Then it went completely still, inert as any piece of metal should be. The instant I placed the sphere in the surgical tray, the dog's vital signs stabilized completely. Heart rate normalizing to textbook parameters, breathing deepening to healthy levels, body temperature rising toward normal ranges as if some internal switch had been flipped from emergency preservation mode to active recovery. The thread-like filaments I'd seen on the X-ray turned out to be even more complex than the imaging had suggested. Under surgical magnification, they appeared to be composed of the same mysterious material as the central sphere, but arranged in patterns that looked almost neural, like a secondary nervous system that had been overlaid onto his existing anatomy, monitoring and perhaps controlling functions I couldn't identify. As I carefully extracted each filament, documenting their positions and connections for later analysis, I noticed that they detached from his tissue without resistance, as if they'd been designed for easy removal once their purpose was complete. Whatever system they represented had fulfilled its function and was ready to be deactivated. I named him River during his recovery, though I couldn't have explained why the name felt so immediately right. There was something about his patient endurance, his purposeful journey to deliver the mitten, that reminded me of water finding its way to the sea. Inevitable, persistent, shaped by obstacles, but never deterred from its ultimate destination. During his recovery over the next few days, River's healing progressed with supernatural speed. The surgical incision closed cleanly within 48 hours, showing none of the inflammation or tenderness typical of major abdominal surgery. His appetite returned with enthusiasm, and his coat began to regain its natural luster with each passing day. But it was the other changes that convinced me River was no ordinary animal. The fluorescent lights in his recovery kennel flickered whenever he passed beneath them, creating patterns that seemed almost like communication, not random electrical fluctuations, but deliberate sequences of illumination that repeated with mathematical precision. The clinic's usually reliable electrical systems developed intermittent malfunctions whenever River was nearby. Computers would restart unexpectedly, medical equipment would cycle through self-diagnostic routines without prompting, and the radio in the break room began picking up signals from stations that shouldn't reach our geographic area. But most unsettling was the way children began returning to my clinic, drawn by compulsions they couldn't articulate to their parents. The same kids who had formed that silent circle at the school started appearing at my door during after-school hours, asking to see the dog who remembers. Their parents brought them reluctantly, unable to explain their children's sudden obsession, but unwilling to deny requests made with such unusual intensity. 7-year-old Sophie Martinez was the first to articulate what the others seemed to sense intuitively. She approached River's kennel with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space and whispered something that made my chest tighten with recognition. He remembers someone who's still missing. He was carrying her with him, but now he needs help finding where she went. If you're feeling this moment the way I did when it happened, please leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. It means more than you know, because what happened when I started investigating the connection between River and the missing child would prove that some mysteries require not just medical intervention, but courage to follow where the evidence leads. That evening, I researched missing children reports for our area, following instincts I couldn't rationalize but couldn't ignore. What I found in the local police database made the pale blue mitten feel suddenly heavier in my hands, weighted with implications I was only beginning to understand. 2 years ago, an 8-year-old girl named Lila Brennan had vanished while walking home from Brookfield Elementary. Last seen 3 blocks from the school, wearing her winter coat and pale blue mittens that her grandmother had knitted for her birthday. The search had continued for months, involving state police and FBI resources, but no trace of her had ever been found. The case remained open, but inactive, another unsolved tragedy that had gradually faded from public attention as newer emergencies demanded resources and focus. The address where Lila was last seen was less than 50 yards from where River had collapsed. I spent that night studying every detail of Lila's case file, which the police had made available to the public in hopes that community awareness might generate new leads. She'd been a quiet, thoughtful child who loved animals and often lingered after school to help teachers care for the classroom pets. Her route home took her past the maintenance area behind the school district's equipment shed through a small wooded area that provided a shortcut to her neighborhood. The investigation had focused initially on the possibility of stranger abduction, then shifted to examine family connections, and finally expanded to consider the involvement of known offenders in the area. But no physical evidence had ever been recovered. No witnesses had come forward with useful information, and the case had gradually gone cold, as leads evaporated and resources were redirected to more recent disappearances. What struck me as I read through the reports was how thoroughly the search teams had covered the immediate area around the school. They'd used tracking dogs, ground-penetrating radar, even brought in specialists with cadaver detection equipment. But somehow, they'd missed something, or perhaps the evidence simply hadn't been there to find at the time. The next afternoon, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I loaded River into my truck and drove to the intersection where Lila Brennan had disappeared. I had no clear plan, no specific expectations, just the growing certainty that River had been trying to communicate something important, and I needed to help him finish whatever mission had brought him to that school. The moment I opened the truck door in the parking area behind Brookfield Elementary, River leaped out and began pulling at his leash with desperate urgency. Not toward the residential streets where the search teams had focused their efforts, not toward the park where children typically played, but toward the maintenance area behind the school district's equipment shed. His behavior was unlike anything I'd observed during his recovery. The patient, almost meditative calm that had characterized his healing process was replaced by focused intensity, as if proximity to this location had reactivated systems that the surgery had temporarily disabled. He moved with purpose, following a path that seemed predetermined, guided by senses I couldn't share. He stopped abruptly at a patch of ground that looked identical to everything surrounding it. No obvious disturbance, no visible markers, nothing that would attract attention from casual observers. The area was covered with the same fallen leaves, the same scattered debris, the same unremarkable vegetation that characterized the entire wooded section behind the school. But River sat down precisely in the center of this seemingly random space and looked up at me with an expression of patient expectation, as if waiting for me to understand what he'd been trying to show me all along. His amber eyes held the same urgent communication I'd seen when he'd released the mitten into my hands, the same purposeful intelligence that suggested he was operating according to knowledge I didn't possess. When I knelt beside him and pressed my palm against the earth, it felt different somehow, hollow, like standing on a surface that concealed empty space beneath. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of detail that becomes obvious once you know to look for it. The ground here had been disturbed at some point, then carefully restored to match the surrounding area. I called the police from the wooded area, speaking to Detective Morrison, who had been the lead investigator on Lila's case. His voice carried the weary patience of someone who had fielded dozens of false leads over the years. But when I described River's behavior and the circumstances of his discovery, Morrison agreed to meet me at the location within the hour. Dr. Leclerc, I have to tell you, we've had psychics, dowsers, even people claiming their pets could sense supernatural presences. Most of the time it leads nowhere. But something about what you're describing? He paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. There were details about this case that we never released to the public. If your dog really did find something that belonged to Lila, that changes things significantly. 2 days later, the excavation team arrived with equipment that could penetrate several feet below the surface without destroying potential evidence. River maintained his vigil from a respectful distance throughout the process, never approaching the dig site, but never leaving either. His behavior during those long hours was remarkable. Alert but calm, watchful but patient, as if he understood that his part of the work was complete, and now he needed to trust others to finish what he'd started. The first discovery came 18 inches below the surface, fabric fragments that matched the description of Lila's winter coat. Then, carefully preserved in a plastic container that had protected them from moisture and decomposition, more personal effects: a school ID card, a small silver bracelet, and the matching pale blue mitten that completed the pair River had carried to the school. But it was what they found at the 24-inch level that confirmed everyone's worst fears and provided the closure the Brennan family had been seeking for 2 years. Human remains, small and carefully arranged, surrounded by evidence that would eventually lead investigators to understand exactly what had happened to Lila and who was responsible. Throughout the excavation process, River's behavior remained remarkably consistent. He watched from his chosen position about 30 yards from the dig site, occasionally shifting to track the movement of personnel, but never showing signs of distress or agitation. It was as if he'd carried this burden for as long as necessary, and was now ready to let others assume responsibility for the next phase of justice. When I finally approached him after the remains had been carefully removed and the site secured as evidence, he did something he'd never done before. River stood up, walked directly to me, and leaned his full weight against my legs, not seeking comfort, but offering it. As if he understood that his purpose had been fulfilled, and now both of us needed to process the weight of what we'd discovered together. The investigation that followed moved swiftly. Once physical evidence provided leads that had been missing for 2 years. The plastic container that had preserved Lila's belongings bore fingerprints that matched a maintenance worker who had access to the school grounds and had been questioned briefly during the initial investigation, but released when no evidence connected him to the disappearance. River had carried more than a piece of fabric in his mouth that morning. He'd carried memory, responsibility, the unfinished business of a child whose story had been interrupted before its natural conclusion. Some dogs don't just survive trauma. They become vessels for the experiences that others can't bear to hold alone. Guardians of truth that waits patiently for the right moment to surface. The arrest came 3 weeks later, along with a confession that provided answers to questions the Brennan family had been carrying for years. The maintenance worker, facing overwhelming physical evidence, admitted to the crime and provided details that allowed investigators to understand the timeline of events that had taken Lila's life. But for me, The most important discovery was simpler and more profound than the criminal justice resolution. River had demonstrated that love doesn't end with death, that some connections transcend the boundaries between species, and that sometimes the most important job we can do is simply listening when someone is trying to tell us something we're not ready to hear. River lives with me now, and the changes in his behavior since completing his mission have been remarkable. The urgent intensity that had driven him to carry Lila's mitten across unknown distances has been replaced by the peaceful contentment of a dog who has fulfilled his purpose. He sleeps deeply through the night, dreams that seem gentle rather than haunted, plays with toys with the enthusiasm of an animal who has remembered what it means to simply exist in the present moment. But I know his story isn't really over. There are other children out there whose stories haven't found their witnesses yet, other mysteries waiting for guardians brave enough to carry them home, and I suspect River's ability to remember what others have forgotten might be needed again when the time is right and the circumstances align. Sometimes I wonder about the object I removed from his stomach, now secured in a specialized containment unit at a government facility whose name I'm not allowed to mention. The officials who came to collect it were polite but evasive about its origins and purpose, offering explanations that raised more questions than they answered. But late at night, when I watch River sleeping peacefully in his bed beside mine, I think I understand its true function. Not a tracking device or monitoring system, but something more profound. A technological bridge between memory and matter, between loss and recovery, between the silence of the disappeared and the voices of those who refuse to stop listening. The children who formed that circle around River at the school still visit occasionally, drawn by connections they're too young to articulate but old enough to honor. They sit quietly with him, sharing that profound understanding that some truths are too important to be communicated through words alone. And sometimes, when the afternoon light hits the clinic windows at just the right angle, I see other shadows moving at the edges of my vision, not threatening, but hopeful. As if the work River and I did together has created space for other mysteries to surface, other voices to be heard, other stories to find their way home through the patient dedication of those willing to carry them. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. If it touched you, please subscribe, leave your comment below, and know how grateful I am for having you here. Because some stories choose their storytellers, and some truths require witnesses willing to follow where love leads, even when the path takes us through territories we never expected to explore. In a world that often forgets its missing children, maybe the greatest gift we can offer is the promise that someone will always be listening, always be searching, always be ready to carry their memories home.